another European settler colony that is based on, of course, as we know, the concept of Jewish homeland, but that's just, as we know and as many of us learned, was just the slogan of it to recruit a lot of Eastern Jews. So settler colonialism, as I mentioned, it's all about the land. It's all about destroying the natives, destroying their lives, committing genocide against them. And genocide here, not necessarily the the liquidation of the natives or the indigenous people. Not that you commit a genocide and you kill millions of people like what happened in the United States of America. Significantly, it can mean also having control, complete or absolute control over their lives. This is what happened in Palestine. Half of the population were expelled outside of Palestine. Thousands were killed, but the majority, the other half of the Palestinians lived there under the direct control of the settler colonial project that happened in Palestine. So genocide or elimination doesn't mean just the liquidation or the committing a massacre against the majority of the population. It's in this context, it means also the complete control and domination of their lives. Everything, their movements, their economy, their political systems, complete domination. And why is this important? It's important in the context of understanding what does resistance mean to Palestinians. As I quoted Patrick Wolf when he talked about settler colonialism, he said that settler colonialism is about the land. The fight is about the land. And in this regard, land means life. And any contest to the land means contest to life. So to Palestinians, the fight for their land is a fight for their life. Being displaced from their lands means the elimination of their lives. That's literally what it means. So when we talk about settler colonialism and the concept of colonialism and the concept of Palestine, as Albert Meme mentioned that in his book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, the colonized in general, when they're facing oppression, when they're facing colonialism, they have only two ways out, right? One way was assimilation. Number two is to fight back. Assimilation, of course, we know it's impossible, right? When you have a superior ideology, and as we know, Zionism is a superior ideology, just like white supremacy, the ideologies and the ethos of Europe in the 19th century, and those colonial, racist, superior ethos that were Europe used to legitimize and justify colonialism, right? This is how they colonized Africa, colonized the rest of the world, specifically in the global south, by saying, we have the white man burden. It's our mission, the civilizing mission, is to go and civilize the rest of the world. This is our duty. This is what God wants us to do. This is what enlightenment wants us to do. And this is something we need to do. So when you are superior, when you feel that you're superior and everybody else is below you, then you're technically leaving the indigenous people and the colonized no choice but to fight back. Otherwise, they will be enslaved and they will be treated not just even a second-class citizen, they will be treated as they're subhumans, as if they're not humans. And we've witnessed this in all of the history of colonialism in India and in Africa and the rest of the world. That the quote-unquote uncivilized subjects are not worthy of being saved and not worthy of even... At one point, colonizers did not even want to use the labor of the indigenous people because they thought they were not good enough, so they would import workers from outside of the colonized land. That's how racist and superior these ideologies exist. So, not to theorize too much about these concepts, but I think it's important to bring it up here for us to understand that resistance is not a privilege. Resistance is not... a different strategy that people use to fight or to win political means. Resistance is the only option. And by resistance, of course, I don't mean only armed resistance. By resistance, as I mentioned before, that when you have a fight over the land, because land, a contention or contesting land means contesting life, it means that your mere existence on the land of Palestine is resistance. What we know in Palestine, the concept of sumud, the concept of resilience, the concept of preservation, the concept of steadfastness, all of these words can maybe attribute to the world sumud, the concept of actually standing tall to defend your homeland by simply just existing and rejecting of your homeland being stolen and rejecting to compromise, rejecting to accept that this land belongs to Israelis or to Zionists. This by itself is a form of resistance. Rejecting to normalize concept of colonialism, rejecting to accept that the state of Israel can exist on the Palestinian land. All of these things are resistance, because this is, as I mentioned, is the only option for the colonized subject to deal with settler colonialism. It's not that they have a choice. They don't have a choice, but again, what do they do with it? So this intro is very important because it will kind of give us a grounding in terms of where we headed in terms of how Palestinian resistance and the history of the resistance in Palestine, specifically when we talk about political resistance, armed resistance, strikes and protests. With that being said, I divided the timeline into a couple of categories. The first category is resistance to the settler colonial project prior to 1948. And for any of you who is not familiar, 1948 in the Palestinian cause is considered the year of Nakba, the year of catastrophe, because this is when Israel was created as an official state. Of course, that project, settler colonial project, did not start in 1948, as we know that the first settler colony or settlement that was created in 1981. It's called Ptah Fikva. Was created as the first European Jewish settlers who came from Europe, took over a land, stole the land, created a settlement for themselves. And since that time, from 1881, where the Palestinian peasants start fighting back and started realizing that they are European settlers. And I want to make it very clear here, when I moving forward, when I say Jewish settlers, I'm talking about Zionist European settlers who came from Europe illegally to the land of Palestine in hopes and in the mission of creating the settler colonial project of Israel. I'm not talking about Jews as in Jewish people. I'm talking about, just want to make that clear. I know most of us here know this, but just a disclaimer. Because Palestine itself, there's a lot of Jews that lived in Palestine prior to the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. So when these settlements started happening since 1880, even before the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, there was still conversations, and Joseph Mas'ad talks about this in one of his books, where colonial powers in Europe were really interested in creating a colony in Palestine. And one of the ideas that he talked about, we don't want to go through it right now, is that they really were thinking about creating a settler colonial project in Palestine to protect their interests in the region. So this concept of creating that settler colonial project in Palestine was not just created after the first Zionist Congress summit in 1897. This started way before that. So since the creation of the settler immigration settlements in Palestine since the 1880s, as I mentioned, Palestinian peasants started fighting back, started resisting, creating ambushes, firing at these settlements. Palestinian leaders, specifically in Jerusalem, and at that time, you got to understand, Palestinians in general, that we didn't have a lot of ideologies. There was no sense of different ideologies, whether you're an Islamist, a leftist. It was more of the common people of Palestine, where their ethnicity is Palestinian, their religion were either Muslim or Christian. The concept of secularism, the concept of modernity were not that relevant at that time. They were not that important in that part of the region. To them, our religion is Islam or Christianity or a Jew, and we live in Palestine. We're all part of this area, so ideology was not that important. However, religious figures were important at that period. They were considered civil leaders. They were considered people who would advocate for their people. So since 1881 until today, Palestinian leaders, the civil society, have been issuing and protesting against this illegal settlement of European colonizers to come in Palestine. And they started sending in, kind of protesting to the Ottoman empires at that time. The Ottoman Empire was in charge of Palestine, and they were sending messages that, hey, we are noticing that European colonizers are coming in and creating settlements in the land of Palestine. So resistance at that time clearly Palestinians realized that something was being cooked. And they understood, with the concept knowing about colonialism, that if we don't do something now, then we might be losing the country. I don't think they were thinking it will go that far, but they are seeing that there are a lot of organized illegal immigration coming in from Europe since the 1880. Now, as I mentioned, after the first Zionist Congress in 1897, where the Zionists declared that Palestine should be officially the Jewish homeland. And many of you know this, that the Zionist movement were talking about Uganda project, Argentina project. They were thinking about lands to go and colonize, and eventually they agreed on Palestine. We don't have to go into details into this. After the 1900s, there were massive signature projects to mobilize the Palestinian community to sign papers, to sign letters of condemnation, to send them to the leaders, specifically the Ottoman leaders at that time, to tell them that we're really standing against this illegal immigration that is coming and these illegal settlements that are being created. So the focus back then was done by issuing petitions, by strikes, by buying lands at risk. So, for example, there were some villages where some lands were very close to the newly established settlements, and they are at risk of being bought because people are afraid or whatnot. Then there's a coalition of people would go and actually buy that land to make sure that the new settler, Jewish settlers who come in, don't buy that land from these poor peasants and bully them into selling it to them. And that continued all the way to the First World War, again with the collaboration on strikes and protests and pushing petitions to the Ottoman leadership, all the way to the 1919, specifically after Balfour Declaration and Sykes-Picot. The concept of the first organized resistance militia was created, and that was called the Fidaiya Association, or there's another name for it. It used to be called the Black Hand or the Black Palm, and that was the first attempt to create an actual organized militia that will fight back against settler colonialism and against the British colonization of Palestine. And of course, unfortunately, that did not last long. People of Palestine did not have experience in dealing with colonialism. This is the first time they're being colonized. They didn't have the concept of modernity, the concept of a nation states. All of these things were not very familiar with them. Yes, there are some intellectual elite class that existed that were aware of these things, but unfortunately, a lot of them were not very involved in these conversations with the common people, specifically the peasants. At the beginning of the settler colonial project, as I mentioned, since land is the most important aspect of the struggle, then the most affected ones are the peasants. Specifically, these settlements were created near villages on the top of the mountains. Clearly, there was a strategy behind it, and the strategy was from the early days of Zionism. The Zionist project in Palestine is to take over the lands that are usually on high levels, so that way it's more strategically protective for them. In 1920, there was a very famous revolt that happened during, it's called the Prophet Musa or Prophet Moses revolt. It happened during the commemoration of Prophet Musa. It's like a traditional folklore thing that happens in Palestine every year. People celebrate the legacy of Prophet Musa. During that time, there was a lot of clashes happened between the Jewish settlers and the Palestinians, and that erupted, and it was a few weeks of back and forth of strikes, of protest, of actually clashes and fighting and shooting. It was one of the first revolts that really happened. Unfortunately, of course, as we know, the British colonizers were standing with the Zionists against the Palestinians, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and they killed, of course, a few Palestinians, and some Jewish settlers were also killed. And since then, of course, I continued. Again, the resistance continued to be intellectual. There was a lot of conversations in the newspapers, specifically newspapers like Al-Karamel. It was one of the most famous newspapers in Palestine that from early days understood what was happening, and they were intellectually educating people about this settler colonial project. And there was a lot of, ambitious attacks against these settlements that were created since 1881, but nothing in a very organized fashion. It would be like a group of armed men within a village. They will get together, form a kind of a militia together, and start attacking or creating ambushes against British soldiers or Zionist Haganah terrorist members. In 1929, there was the famous Al-Buraq revolt, which is the Buraq is the wall, western wall of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which it was at that time where Jewish settlers started claiming that the western wall is something that belongs to the state of to us as Jews, and it should be part of our new project, the new Israeli state that we want to create, and we want to take it over. You know, to Palestinians at that time, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, that's part of Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's part of Palestine, and it's something that is to us. You as a foreign settlers are coming here and try to take over our religious sites, and that's not something we're going to stand for. Since then, I think in the Palestinian history, things have evolved significantly. In 1929, there was a lot of committees that were created to protect Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it was formed by Muslims and Christian organizations. At that time, they even created it's called the Executive Committee of the Muslim Christian Conference. So they understood that this war, what was happening, is not really religious in a holy war, but more of this is a settler colonial project that requires us as the natives of this land to claim it, and unity within the native people is very important at that time, realizing that this is not just Muslims versus Jews or Jews versus Muslims. Since then, I think Palestinian historians mentioned that after the 1929, the armed resistance have evolved significantly. More militias. There was like literally ambushes and attacks against these, as I mentioned, settlements and British soldiers throughout the years. In Al Buraq revolt, the British colonizers killed about 116 Palestinians, and at the end of the Al Buraq revolt, there was another militia that was created. Remember when I told you about the Black Hand? Another militia was called the Green Hand this time. And of course, the British colonizers eliminated that group within 1 year. Moving quickly to 1935, which is one of the most important revolts in the Palestinian history. It was called Al-Qassam Revolt. Many of you know Al-Qassam was a Syrian Muslim preacher or scholar who was fighting French colonialism in Syria. Later on, when he was wanted, he escaped. He came to Palestine. He spent 10 years raising new generation of men and women to fight colonialism, and he realized and understood, and he basically all his theories were, we can't keep just talking about the evil of colonialism and settler colonialism, we have to do something about it. And the only way for us, because he understood the concept that this is a fight for land, this is a fight for life, we have to engage in armed resistance. And that revolt was very inspiring for many reasons, and I'll come back to it later. But it started really very much so the organized, organic, popular way of actually resisting, armed resisting the occupation. Before that, as I mentioned, everything was done on an individual level, small peasants here and there, small villages, and attempt to create militias, but nothing so success as much as what Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam did in 1935. He did not last long. Eventually, the British colonizers killed him in the forest of Jenin with all the majority of his people. So him and his party or his group by themselves did not last more than a couple of years after him, but they played a significant role into the concept of armed resistance. All the way to 1936, which is the 1936 revolt, and it's considered to be the Great Palestinian Revolt because it lasted over six months of strikes, non-stop strikes. And this revolt was literally an answer to the killing of Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam. As I mentioned, he was a great inspiration to the Palestinian movement in terms of resisting and fighting back. The Palestinians engaged in 170 days of strikes and civil disobedience against the British colonizers. When the British colonizers realized that they're losing power over people, 6 months of continuous protests and strikes and fighting back, they created what's so-called the Royal Peel Commission. The Peel Commission was basically the British colonizers to, as usual, creating a bureaucracy, of creating an investigation committee to understand why are Palestinians so upset. I mean, everybody knows why they're upset, but of course, they have to create bureaucracy. That's part of the colonial archive. This Peel Commission took a couple of months to investigate. Eventually, they came with the conclusion that Palestinians are upset. They actually have I forget the exact language, but basically said Palestinians have a reason to be upset because their land is being taken away. The best answer moving forward is to deal with their grievances, is to create a partition plan. So the first idea of creating a partition plan before the UN actually did it was to divide. The Dispute Commission, advocated for creating a partition plan to give part of that land to the new Jewish settlers that came from Europe, and give a little bit of land to the Palestinians and Arabs that lived in that land. Of course, Palestinians rejected it. Even the Zionist movement at that time also rejected it, because they were hoping of getting a larger piece of the land, and that instigated things even further. So after 6 months of strikes, non-stop strikes, and then this Peel Commission report came out, then things intensified, and more clashes, the forming of a lot of militias. There were forming of martial courts to even punish those who sell their lands to the Jewish settlers. There were martial courts to people who even normalize with them and kind of sell out their people. There was it was a moment of revolutionary, a revolutionary moment, pivotal moment for the Palestinian cause. And there's an estimate that after the 1937, there was at least 10,000 organized rebels that were ready to be engaged in armed resistance. So this is significance in that sense. As I mentioned, this is when they started becoming a little bit more organized, more intellectual, more theorized, that this is actually something we need to engage on a national level rather than individualistically. And then, of course, there's many organizations that were created. The most famous one was called the Holy Jihad Movement by Al-Husseini, and it was very significant in that regard into fighting the Zionist settler colonialism. And just really quickly, when we talk about Holy Jihad, I know this crowd is not an issue, but you got to understand, and this is something someone like Professor Hafsa can talk about this more than me, but the concept of the war on terror, right? To weaponize the Muslim language. And some of the things that Muslims and the natives use usually is weaponized by Western colonizers. Just because they call their movement Holy Jihad, it doesn't mean it's a religious war. It means that it's part of their identity as Muslims to defend their land. And according to their teachings and ideology and theology, defending your land is a form of jihad. So it's not a jihad in the sense of like what we like to hear in the war and terror campaign, that the word jihad is problematic. No, at that time, people are using their own vocabulary, their own terminology, their own epistemology, and it's something that we have to be aware of. After that, of course, as I mentioned, organized militias, they started understanding that they have to be strategic. They can't just be attacking settlements and soldiers only. They have to actually shut down the infrastructure of the colonial powers, the British colonial powers. They started attacking infrastructure like bridges and railroads to basically stop the movement of British army that is constantly providing support to the Zionist terrorist organizations like Haganah's. And something very important to mention here, in the 1936 and 97, in this revolt, many of you know maybe the Major Wingate, one of the most famous British generals, was like a psychotic bloodbath. Like, he was a bloody human being in general. Not that British colonizers were not that bloody, but this guy was especially psychotic. He was one of the people who really trained a lot of the Zionist militias, specifically the Haganahs, and he handpicked some of these leaders. And some of the leaders he picked were Moshe Dayan, who was later on became the Israeli defense minister. This guy created this concept of the special night squads. Special night squads were British soldiers, in addition to Zionist Haganah members, who would actually go door to door, terrorize Palestinians at night, to engage in the concept of counterinsurgency. And you got to understand, at that time in the early 1930s, the population-centric counterinsurgency was becoming on a rise. It's something the West has learned about, specifically in the experience of Malay and the French and Americans start realizing that we have to tackle, and even British, of course, before the Americans, the concept of population-centric, meaning that the population has to understand that they cannot support resistance, because if they support rebels, they will pay the price for it. So now instead of, as we know, many of you, if you're familiar with counterinsurgency, there's two theories. You tackle the insurgents themselves or you attack their bases. So this is where the idea of starting making Palestinians pay the price for the actions of the rebels where it actually started happening. So Zionists learned it from the colonial archive, and it was taught to them by the General Wingate, a British major general who existed in Palestine. And this is very important. I'll talk about it a little bit later. I need to move a little bit faster. But again, during the Nakba, all the way to 1948, all of this continued, the ambushes, the attacks against Israeli Zionist militias, against British colonizers. Many attacks happened, like the Surif ambush, or what is known in Israeli archive, the Gush Etzion convoy in 1948 was one of the biggest ambushes. It killed about, I think, 25 or 35 soldiers, some of the Zionist militias. In even 1948, there was the battles of the Triangle of Hur that existed in Mount Carmel near Haifa, where the three villages there, Jab'a, one of them was. A lot of these rebels were very strategically attacking Zionist militias, attacking British colonizers all the time at that time. So they were, even during the year of Nakba, and maybe this is not famous to say, a lot of people like to make Nakba the year of catastrophe. It's all about pain of Palestinians, but there's a lot of pride to it, which is, yes, a lot of our people were killed and massacres were committed, but don't forget, massacres were not committed for the sake of massacres. They were committed as a strategic move to scare people off, to push them away from their homeland. The idea is that Zionists committed that massacre, specifically in Deir Yassin, to let other villages know that your turn is coming, so you better run away, otherwise we're going to come and massacre you. So the concept was to scare people off. So other Palestinians and other resistance groups and fighters realized that, so it was important for them to fight back, literally until the last bullet. Literally, these guys had, and it's very important to acknowledge this, that Zionist militias were trained by colonial powers. The British colonial power was the strongest in the whole world at that time. So they trained them everything. And many of the scholars say that the Zionist movement literally adopted the European colonial archive. So it's very essential here to admit that Palestinians had no military intelligence. They had literally no wireless way of communicating with each other, no wireless radios. And even if they did, I think they had a couple of them in Jerusalem area, it was not encrypted. So literally Zionists were sitting on the other side hearing everything they talk about. So there's no complexity. It was very simple. It's literally very simplistic. And this is important to understand, that these people fought back to the last bullet that they had in realizing that it's either they die to defend their land or they're going to lose their land, even though the power was completely unmatched. Very important to mention here, again, I don't want to go through everything, is that in 1948, a group of women, it's called Mom's Flower Association, that was created by a bunch of women as an armed resistant wing led by women, and the whole association was created by women to be engaged in armed resistance. And this organization, Zahrat al-Qahawan in Arabi, was a very famous organization. Unfortunately, it didn't last too long because British colonizers and Zionists will tackle them right away. Again, moving a little bit quickly. And I lasted a little bit on this period because it's important to understand that period and the capabilities that Palestinians had at that time. From 1948 all the way to 1967, a lot of the resistance have moved from, since the complete domination of the new settlers in Palestine, specifically after 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, the majority of the resistance attacks started happening from neighboring countries, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood, or Ikhwan in Egypt, played a big role into sending a lot of soldiers to be involved in the wars in the 1948, in the attacks, the armed resistance to defend Palestine, even sending them to volunteer in Arab armies at that time. And it's also important to understand that later on that leaders of Fatah actually erupted, the Fatah as a movement erupted from these efforts. So resistance continues. I'm going to go quickly from 1948 all the way to 1967. Let's say thousands of operations. I think there was numbers, I don't have the exact numbers now, but historians estimate there's at least 10 operations on a daily basis were happening. So Palestinians were still actively engaged in resistance. But majority of them were happening, yes, from neighboring countries and coming in to the land of Palestine. One thing happened in 1967, and that was a pivotal moment in the Palestinian cause, as we know, the so-called Six-Day War, where the Arab countries lost to Israel. Of course, that's using Western concept of POV of how to look at that war, but that's more to it. But what's important right now is that moment was essential to the Palestinian movement because, and specifically even the war in 1956, the Suez Canal War, the Palestinians realized that the Arab nations, they can't be relied upon to defend and to resist against the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Specifically after 1956, when Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, he started cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood, which was kind of the popular base of sending resistance fighters to Palestine. Palestinians realized it's time to stop relying on these neighboring countries and their regimes and start relying on ourselves. And this is where Yasser Arafat, and other Fatah leaders came out of these efforts. They were actually part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they realized the issues with Jamal Abdel Nasser, that now let's remove the Islamic umbrella that we have and start talking about nationalist, secular mindset. And don't forget, the 50s, 60s were the new age of secularism and left in the region, the concept of the bipolar war between Russia and the US. So there's a lot of influence there too. So this is where Fatah was created in 1958 as an extension of that effort. And later on in 1967, George Habash famously, of course, created the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Again, George Habash is important because in the 50s, he was involved in something called the Arab Nationalist Movement, which is a movement, is an armed resistance anti-colonialist movement. But again, this gives you an idea that the shift has focused from Arab nationalism all the way to becoming Palestinian-centric movements. Since 1967, and of course the PLO was created, the Palestinian Liberation Movement was created in 1964, again, was under the support of the Arab regimes, specifically Egypt leadership. After 1967, when the Arab countries lost and Palestinians realized they need to rely on themselves, they started creating these organizations. It was estimated that at least 30 factions were created with different ideologies around that time. So this is important for me to mention because it gives you an idea, the different formation, the shift of focus, the shift of ideologies, the shift of even networks, the shift of which groups are aligned with each other, right? Now it's Palestinians on their own. Before it was completely supported by the regimes around them, specifically in Egypt. What's really important here was the Karama battle in March 1968. Karama battle was an area by the Jordan Valley between Jordan and so-called Israel, where the Palestinian armed resistance would actually train. It was like the training camps for them. So Israelis kind of attack it, and then the resistance and the Fatah members and the Jordan army were engaged in a battle, and eventually they won against the Israeli aggression. And that was a huge boost for the Palestinian resistance, but it also created another problem. It created a problem for the Jordanian regime. King Hussein, if many of you heard of him in the past, he was, as we know, like a colonial, I don't want to say agent, but he's a stooge for colonial powers, right? Specifically to the British. So he realized now that the Palestinian resistance is gaining a lot of momentum. It was based in Jordan, the Palestinian resistance at that time. So before 1967, before 1948, the majority of the resistance was within the historic Palestine land. After 1948, all the way to 1967, or even after that, until the first Intifada, the Palestinian resistance started the base was in Jordan. King Hussein realized that the Palestinian resistance was getting so much momentum. The people of Jordan almost worship them and they see them as heroes. So it becomes like a clash for power. And unfortunately, it's the truth. We have to be honest with ourselves. Some Palestinian leaders and resistance movements, specifically from Fatah, and even in the Democratic Party for Liberation in Jordan, were doing things that were not the best. They were basically going around towns, acting like they owned the place, cursing sometimes Jordanians, creating problems. some bad things happened. This is part of our history, unfortunately. This is where the King Hussein took advantage of that, and he went to his people and said, "Oh, these people, Palestinians," and start playing on division between Palestinians and Jordanians, specifically in the 70s. And he realized the power of Fatah and the power of the Palestinian resistance. So that led to all of the issues with Jordan and led to what we know as Black September, which happened in December 1970, which is when Palestinians were kicked out of Jordan and King Hussein wanted to get rid of them. And then there was a group that was created by some Fatah, Khalil Wazir, Abu Jihad, who created an organization called Black September to exert revenge against the Jordanian regime, and they ended up killing the Prime Minister of Jordan. Situations, of course, got worse. Eventually, Palestinian resistance were forced to leave Jordan and move to Lebanon, and this created a different dynamic. Before I move to Lebanon quickly, it's important to know that in the late 1960s, the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for Liberation, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, started engaging in a new form of resistance, which is hijacking airplanes. And we know that the first one was done in Flight 840 in 1969. And it's important to realize at that time, at that moment in the 60s and the 70s, Palestinians started realizing that the world is moving past them, that the Palestinian cause is not important anymore, nobody's giving it attention. Zionism and Israeli as a state are gaining a lot of momentum. They're getting more powerful. They're building more allyship with the West. America now is becoming more supportive after 1956. They're becoming directly more supportive to the Israeli settler colonial project as a client state for American imperialism. So they engaged in those form of action, hijacking airplanes. And that's something that is part of the resistance that happened. There was other massive operations that happened from Jordan all the way attacking to Palestine, but the majority of the big one were actually starting from Lebanon after Palestinian resistance moved to Lebanon in 1970. The most important one was done in 1974, what we know as the Kiryat Shmone settlement, where the PFLP kind of attacked the settlement and they engaged in clashes and killed soldiers, and some of them were killed. A lot of these similar attacks happened. There's a lot of them, like Savory Hotel attack, in 1975. I don't want to go through them, but I wanted to bring you a couple of examples of that. So what's important here, and of course some of you know the Munich attack in 1972. As you know, the Palestinians requested from Germany to be allowed for their team to play in the Olympics. Germany told them, we don't acknowledge you as a state, you can't participate. So the Black September organization that was born out of Fatah went into capturing the Israeli members of the Olympics team in order to exchange them to the Palestinian prisoners. And it's important to note here that another mission for hijacking airplanes at that time was always prisoners exchange. And this becomes very relevant when I move on with the timeline, that Palestinians since day one, when they were engaging in Palestinian resistance, they always had political prisoners exchange as part of their struggle. It was very important to make it a point that people who fight for Palestine, we need to fight back for them and exchange them and take them out of prison. So a lot of times when these attacks happen, they were done in hopes of engaging in a prisoners exchange. However, as we know, as history has told us, that Israelis don't like to play that game, and they prefer to go and attack these airplanes and attack these resistance fighters, and eventually they end up killing the hostages themselves rather than engaging in prisoners exchange. What's important at that period, before I move to the first Intifada, is in 1974, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, proposed something called the 10 Points Program. And this is where a lot of Palestinian scholars and historians say that this was the kind of the collapse of the PLO and the Fatah leadership into starting to thinking about concessions and actually being engaged in so-called peace process. Some of them were impatient. Some of them were just want to go back and have a state. They want to be politicians. And unfortunately, this is the point where they start saying that now we are ready to create a Palestinian state. And they made it clear to say a secular Palestinian state that encompasses anybody who wants to live within it, meaning that they want to live side by side by Zionists when it comes in the state of Israel. This created a lot of division in the Palestinian movement, specifically in the Palestinian Liberation Movement. And it's important to note that after the 1967 war, Yasser Arafat, the leader of Fatah, who was a leader of Fatah and the leader of PLO for decades after that, he basically took control of the Palestinian liberation movement decision-making process. He was literally a one-man show, specifically after the assassination of the other very strong Fatah leaders like Abu Jihad and Abu Yad. These were the historic leaders of Fatah who created Fatah with him. After they were assassinated, it felt that this one-man show is running the Palestinian movement. And at that time, something really important happened, was the creation of the Students' Brigade, which was initially created as a Marxist-Maoist movement in the late 1970s as a response to the division within Fatah, the division within the Palestinian movement, and specifically the division within the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They realized that they're moving in a direction that is not ideal. They're not about liberation anymore. They're about quote-unquote peace processes and concessions and just living quote-unquote in peace. So they created that Marxist-Maoist movement in order to transform the movement into something that is a little bit more materialistically engaged in armed resistance. And at that time, of course, Palestinian movement was in Lebanon since the 1970s, and all of us know the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and that basically pushed the Palestinian liberation movement. At that point, it's not a liberation movement anymore because they were pushed or kicked away all the way to Tunisia. And those who are good with geography, Tunisia is really far from Palestine. So to be engaged in liberation by being thousands of miles away doesn't make any sense. So clearly that push towards Tunisia was to liquidate the Palestinian cause and move the Palestinian resistance movement or liberation movement from a liberation movement to a concession movement, to start having conversations and having back channels. It's pivotal also to mention here the rise of Islamists in that region, specifically after the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. This was a very pivotal moment, even in the Palestinian movement. It was a pivotal moment in the region at large. And the reason for that is Islamists, as I mentioned, in 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is a Muslim organization, ideologically, theologically, it was engaged in the resistance, but they were not done in a formalized Palestinian first organization. When the Palestinian resistance movement was in Jordan, they used to have something called the Shuyukh camps, the Sheikh's camp. And Sheikhs literally in our culture means like someone who's a Muslim, like is practicing Muslim. But don't forget that Fatah leaders, as I mentioned, talked about the crackdown by Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1954. They tried to move away from ideology and create a Fatah as an organization that is like, there's no ideology. I don't want to use the word secular because secular is a little bit aggressive. It's more of like, let's stay without ideologies, without these things. So Islamists or people who have this Islamic tendencies and having Islam as an ideology were part of Fatah, but they had their own thing. Later, the Students' Brigade has transformed into becoming an Islamist mindset rather than a Marxist-Maoist. And this was influenced again by the 1979 Iranian revolution. And this is very important because it opened the door to the rise of Islamism in when I use Islamism, quote-unquote Islamism, you know what I mean, just for simplistic terms. The rise of Islamism in Palestine work, specifically in Gaza, and specifically in social work. At that time, Muslim rebels were part of the movement. As I mentioned before, there was no sense of ideologies in the early days of the revolution, the early days of resistance, with the exceptions of the formation of Fatah, and specifically PFLP, where ideology played a big role after the 1954. Before that, there's no ideology, zero ideology. As a matter of fact, we can claim that the majority of the resistance within Palestine before 1948 was Islamically based. Azz al-Qassam as a Sheikh, al-Husseini, colony. Most of these organizations, as natives, this is their religion. This is who they are. So the concept of secularism or the division was not that important. But social work has started in the 1970s and continued all the way to the 80s, which later on led to the foundation of Hamas. Before Hamas, something very important happened in 1985. Remember when I kept saying that the majority of operations and armed resistance ambushes or attacks that happened were happening in the intention of constantly wanting to exchange prisoners? The PFLP, the Center Command, it was a division, and another movement led by Ahmed Jibril, who left PFLP and created his own version, PFLP Center Command, Qiyad al-Ammeh. They were in operation. They took captives a couple of Israeli soldiers, and eventually they did one of the largest prisoners exchange in the history of the cause until 2011. And Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was one of the people who was exchanged in that process. Why is this important? It's important because unfortunately nowadays we hear that some of the people who claim to be pro-Palestine, specifically I can drop the name, like people like Mehdi Hassan, who keep saying that people like Hamas or the Islamist movements were created by Israel to delegitimize Palestinian resistance or Palestinian cause, and that Islamists, they're part of a conspiracy theory by Israel. This is a guy who was in jail for life because he was engaged in Islamist resistance movement in the early 1980s, but he was not known yet. He was just part of the social work more than anybody else. So he was in jail until 1985. So this gives us, again, covers all of these history, the formation of ideology now, paying more attention to the alliance of the region, the power dynamics, the shift in power dynamic in the region between Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, losing Egypt before that after the 1954 war, all the way to the First Intifada. And as I mentioned, after 1948, the majority of the resistance, the armed resistance, was outside of Palestine in the neighboring countries coming into Palestine. And all of this focusing on armed resistance, still Palestinians within the historic land of Palestine were still engaged in other forms of resistance, as I always talked about. The concept of sticking to your land, fighting for your land, protesting, engaging in strikes. This did not stop throughout the years. But armed resistance specifically has moved completely outside of the historic land of Palestine. Until 1987, where the first Intifada started, and I think I'm a little bit behind, so I need to move a little bit quicker. The first Intifada started, and this is created the rise of rebellion from within the land of Palestine, the historic land of Palestine. And there's many significant reasons why this moment was very important. One of them, as I mentioned, was the expelling of the PLO all the way to Tunisia, and people realizing the Fatah leadership and the PLO leadership are about to be engaged in a concession game with Zionism and with the Israeli state in terms of like compromising the land of Palestine. People realize that now it's time for us to start working from inside. But this did not happen magically. As I mentioned, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the Islamists started being engaged in social work. And the most significant part of this is that the first Intifada was in December, right? December 8, 1987, right? When was Hamas created? Anybody knows? December what day? December 14, 1987. Literally 7 days after. So you can't say there's an organization just came out of nowhere 7 days after the beginning of the Intifada. Clearly, there was something being planned, and as I mentioned before, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he was the founder of Hamas, was engaged in armed resistance in the early 1980s, but it was not created in the level of becoming an actual organization. It was smaller groups, because Muslim Brotherhood is too I don't want to go through this right now, but some of the elders did not want to be moving away from social work to armed resistance. They want to stick to social work. But Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and other leaders said, you know what, no, we need to create another organization that is focusing on armed resistance. This was the creation of Hamas in 1987, and of course, before Hamas, when I talked about the Iranian, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1981, of course, Islamic Jihad was created, and it was completely influenced by the Islamic Revolution in Iran. I mean, the majority of their rhetoric and ideology from the very beginning, specifically by Shaqaqi, was literally like adoption of Ali Shariati, adoption of the Islamic Revolution and its principles and its values being anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, they call it istikbar al-Amriki, or like the American hegemony in the region was something very, very fascinating in their rhetoric at that time. So Islamists really caught up with the concept of anti-colonialism early on at that time. And of course, the creation of Hamas created more problems. Now, more problems to Zionism, because before they thought they get rid of Fatah, they get rid of the PLO around the neighbor country. They created security by having regimes in Egypt, in Jordan, and in Lebanon and Syria, either deterred, like Syria and Lebanon, to not engage in armed resistance with Israel, or completely in cahoots with them, like Jordan and Egypt. So the rise of Islamic organization like Hamas created a big problem for them. And a pivotal moment happened in 1992 when Hamas soldiers captured Nassim Toledano. He was an Israeli soldier who was captured to them in order to do what? Again, prisoners exchange. Israeli forces, again, did not engage in prisoners exchange, and they went and they attacked the captors, and they killed them and killed the Israeli soldiers. Because of that, Israel exiled the majority of Hamas leaders and activists into Marj al-Zuhur in Lebanon in 1992. And this created a vacuum of leadership in Palestine at that time. And at that time, it created, that vacuum was filled up by what? The Oslo Accords. This is the time when Fatah wanted to come back to, Yasser Arafat, namely, wanted to come back to Palestine. You remember when I talked about 1974, the 10 points program? What was it? To create a state of Palestine on any liberated land in Palestine, right? This was his hope from 1974. It finally was accomplished. He only wanted to come there. And the plan was to do the Jericho Gaza first, right? This is how we started in 1993. There's other things happened, but one thing I want to mention that was very important was one form of resistance that is always questionable, a lot of people have a hard time with, was the suicide bombing. This is part of our history. We talked about the airplane hijacking. It's very important to realize here that the first suicide bombing happened later in 1994. I forgot the exact month. Was it April or June? I don't remember. But what happened on February 25, 1994 in Hebron? Yes. Baruch Goldstein committed the massacre of Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. He killed 20-something Palestinians, and then the Israeli army continued and killed till more after that. It was a complete massacre where an Israeli settler came in and massacred Muslims praying in their prayer. So at that moment, Hamas as a movement was engaged in armed resistance against Israeli soldiers. It was considered to be the Imad Aql model, meaning that Hamas would literally have one or two small pistols or like guns, and that will travel Hebron and Gaza and Ramallah. They will fire arms at Israeli soldiers and then hide. This is what they used to do, or capture Israeli soldiers to exchange them with Palestinian prisoners. At that time, Hamas realized that the world is watching Israel destroying our lives, killing our people, committing massacres against us. And don't forget, the first Intifada, the breaking of the bone of Palestinians. Many of you know that strategy of literally breaking the hands and the legs of Palestinian youth for throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. At that time, Hamas realized that in order, they need to, I don't want to say exert revenge, but they need to change their strategies and tactics to it's not even matching Israeli level of violence, but to create a sense of deterrence for Israeli army, for the Israeli state to stop targeting Palestinian civilians. Because you remember when I talked about the concept of population-centric counterinsurgency? The concept that the people, the popular base, because I don't talk about theories too much about resistance, but in order for any resistance movement to succeed, the popular base has to support it, right? They have to support them systematically by food, by emotions, and this play a big role of women in the Palestinian movement. Yes, like we know the story of Layla Khalid and Dalal Mughrabi, who were engaged in armed resistance themselves. I talked about the organization in 1948, was created by women for armed resistance, but women in general played a huge role into the Palestinian resistance movement. But that role did not necessarily mean just by carrying guns, but also by creating an, as it's called in scientific terms, like incubator, like a popular incubator where you raise fighters, where you support the fighters, you support them emotionally, you support them tactically and strategically. So in order for Israel to succeed in getting rid of the insurgents, they need to attack who? Their families, their loved ones, which is what we're witnessing today. Where? In Gaza. That's literally what's happening. So that's a strategy that Israel is committing to, not for the sake of massacring. Yes, committing genocide as part of the settler colonial project, but this specific example happened for that reason. So this is where Hamas realized that in order for us to deter them, in order for Hamas to deter Israeli settlers and the army to stop tackling civilians, they needed to engage in suicide bombings. Because to them, this is the only way for us to try to free our land, and liberate it, and to stop Israel from tackling our people. And according to Hamas's reasoning was that every single settler, every single Zionist settler who lives in the land of Palestine is sitting on a stolen Palestinian land. And when we talked about early on about the concept of colonizer and colonized, that the very existence of colonialism is an act of violence, right? Albert Mimi talked about this, Patrick Wolf talked about this, the majority of the colonial scholars talked about that. Colonialism is not an incidental event. It's a continuous violent process by constantly committing violence against the native people. Psychologically, physically, emotionally, you're constantly violating them. And we know the culture of violence and all these things. So to them, this was an essential part. And historically too, Khalid Mash'al, who was a political bureau leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin themselves, many times, and this is very well documented, raised and said to the Israeli government that we will stop the suicide bombing, but we need you to stop targeting Palestinian civilians. We're doing this as an effort to deter you from stopping it. If you stop, we'll stop doing it. And of course, Israeli army and the Israeli state refused that, and they continued to do that until Hamas later on decided to stop using it for their own political reasons and because of the war and terror campaign, but that's a different conversation. Again, moving quickly, I know I don't have a lot of time. Lemisa's is not looking at me, so I feel good about continuing until she gets here. All the rest, resistance continued during Oslo. Unfortunately, Oslo itself created the sense of concession. A lot of people either celebrated it naively, thinking, oh, we won, now we have a Palestinian state, because they're not, the average person who doesn't understand colonialism, resistance, and a lot of them were unfortunately naive enough to believe Arafat because of his historical significance as a legacy as a leader. But Hamas and Islamic Jihad and PFLP continued their resistance. They started targeting soldiers, still targeting checkpoints, all the way to the Second Intifada, which happened in in September. But before September, we heard about the failed Camp David summit. Failed Camp David summit happened in July 2000, and then in September, as we know, famously, Ariel Sharon, he was running to become the Prime Minister of Israel. He basically raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we know to the indigenous people of Palestine, when you do that, you don't just challenge them, and you're like spit in their face, quote unquote, because you tell them like, this colonial domination that I have over you, I'm gonna even come and invade your own, the most religious holy site that you have. So it's a complete, like, you know, beyond, not just a slap in the face, it's like a violent action. So Palestinians responded to that. There were very much clashes, and between 2000 all the way to 2005, Palestinians were engaged in resistance, specifically armed resistance, and things got, you know, remember when we talked about the early 90s, Fatah is no more engaged in armed resistance. They dropped armed resistance. To them now, the way to liberate Palestine is through peace process. And this is where Hamas picked up, and Hamas started gaining more momentum, more popularity, because they are reflecting or representing, or they're basically answering people's call for resistance, for liberating the land. Yasser Arafat at that time, he realized that the failure of the Camp David summit, a lot of Palestinian historians argue that Arafat himself asked the Palestinian security forces to start engaging in resistance. And this has actually happened and led to the creation of the Martyrs of Al-Aqsa Brigades, which is part of Fatah movement for the first time since the Oslo Accords, where Fatah is actually engaged in armed resistance. They dropped armed resistance. They even dropped it from the Palestinian Assembly Congress. Unfortunately, Bill Clinton was attending that conference. How insulting, where you have the backer of your settler colonizers to tell you to change your constitution. But anyways, what's important at that second Intifada phase was the massive population-centered counterinsurgency, specifically in what Israel calls as Operation Defensive Shield. And many of you know this happened in March 2002. If you remember the Battle of Jenin, one of the most important battles in the recent history, and this created the new concept where you have a small refugee camp that has no resources except small weapons that you fire back at Israeli tanks and Israeli airplanes. But that was a heroic battle where Palestinian factions were engaged in this armed resistance. For the first time in a while, Palestinian resistance were able to kill 25 soldiers or so. And this is in the recent history of Palestinian resistance is something new. Historically, specifically after the 1967, and specifically after the first Intifada, when the resistance moved into within Palestine land, it's not uncalled for. Usually, it's like one soldier here, two soldiers there. Outside of the suicide bombing, of course, it was not that. Specifically Israeli soldiers. Also, we know the siege of Bethlehem, the siege of the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, when Israeli army was besieging that for weeks. And what's really famous at that time, a quote from Moshe Ya'alon, who was the defense minister of Israel, again, remind us of what we talked about Wingate, remember? Population-centered counterinsurgency. Moshe Ya'alon, to justify this operation, this invasion of West Bank, he said that the purpose of this operation is to, and I'm paraphrasing here, is to burn into the consciousness of Palestinians that, according to him, terrorism, or what we say resistance, is not going to get them anywhere. They needed to burn into their consciousness to stop resisting and just give up. And this is, again, what I talked about before, learning from Wingate, the special night squad, terrorizing people to make them stop resisting. But again, going back to Albert Memes at the beginning, the two options colonized have: assimilation, enslavement, accepting of being subhumans, or resistance. There's no other way around. So all of these campaigns, all of these terrorism against Palestinians, again, at the end of the day, it's not going to go anywhere. At the end of the second Intifada, what's really important was, again, Arafat was killed in November 2004, but then something very important, and it reaches us to this moment, which is Israel fleeing Gaza in 2005. And this was a huge victory in the second Intifada, because the second Intifada, strategically and tactically and militarily wise, a lot of people say it was a failed Intifada versus the first Intifada. However, many people argue that no, it was actually a success because the resistance was able to kick Israeli settlements outside of Gaza. So Gaza became truly the first liberated Palestinian land under resistance, not under so-called peace process. Now, Hamas was elected into power in 2006. Again, I talked about the rise of Hamas and why people became more enthusiastic about Hamas versus Fatah because of the liberation, because of resistance. And what was more pivotal about that was that when Hamas captured Shalit soldier in 2006, and this Israel responded by, again, attacking civilians in Gaza in so-called Operation Summer Rains in June 2006, all the way to November, start attacking people to try to, quote-unquote, trying to retrieve that soldiers, which usually they refuse to do prisoners exchange. In 2007, a rift happened between Hamas and Fatah. A lot of people say this was the beginning of the division on a national level between Hamas and Fatah, but that's lazy analysis. What really happened was that Hamas realized that they cannot coexist with the Palestinian Authority because Palestinian Authority has turned into a tool for the colonizers. That's the reality. Since the 90s, the Palestinian Authority has been engaged in killing freedom fighters and imprisoning people who are speaking against occupation, against the corruption. So to them, in order for us to engage into resistance truly, we cannot live in the same place. We cannot exist in the same place with these native informants. They're more than native informants. They're like literally native agents to the colonizers. We can't be with them. And this has gotten Gaza to where it is today. Since then, Israel has, as we know, besieged Gaza with cruelty, not allowing anybody to leave or enter, calculating the amount of calories that go into Gaza, and as we know, has engaged into wars from starting from 2008 all the way to today. And when something I don't want to talk too much about the crimes of them because that's not the focus of this talk. But what's really important is, again, the Shalit prisoners exchange happened in 2011. Eventually, this is one of the most significant prisoners exchange that happened since 1984, the one we talked about, where Sheikh Ahmed Yassin came out of prison. This is one of the most significant Palestinian prisoners exchange that happened. But what's really important between 2007 until today, and I'll summarize here and I'll stop for questions and answers because I really dragged it. And I think I need to stop, is that all of these wars in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, the Great March of Return in 2019, which was completely civilian-led. It was a popular movement to actually for the Palestinians to go back to their homes. As you know, 70% of people in Gaza are actually refugees. They are from the so-called Israel 1948 territories. And as you know, the West always tells us, please be the perfect victim and maybe we'll give you a piece of your land back. So these perfect victims literally protested and went to the checkpoints and told the world, we want to go back to our homes. Like, you know, we're peaceful, unarmed, you know, just let us pass. And of course, Israel responded by killing over 200 people. Was it 240 people or 230 something people? So clearly, armed resistance is terrorism. Unarmed or civilian resistance is matched by death. So, like, what else should Palestinians do for their political rights to be gotten? Again, that's irrelevant. I'm not too much invested into proving to the West and specifically to the colonial West that, you know, our resistance is justified. I can care less, but it's important to know that even when Palestinians engaged in these things, as I mentioned in pre-1948, when Palestinians were engaged in strikes, what did the British colonizers do? They shot them down, they killed them, they invaded their masajid. The Special Night Squad were terrorizing people for doing nothing except for being colonized subjects. So what's important, and I'll end with this, from 2005 to today, specifically 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza completely, I want you to imagine this. The first Qassam rocket that was thrown from Gaza to Israeli settlements next to Gaza was in 2001. And at that time, people made fun of it. Remember? It was like called the firecracker. It was a homemade firecracker. It was a joke, all the way to where we are today, where Hamas and not just Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, the majority of these Palestinian factions in Gaza have developed from having one pistol that goes between different cities to be used in different ambushes and different attacks, all the way to becoming an organized, literally, militia or army in Gaza, where you have thousands of soldiers. A lot of them are commandos. A lot of them, as we've seen some of these videos, are called the frogmen, people who literally dive into the sea and go back and attack Israeli military bases. So clearly the resistance have evolved from being small factions, small group of people, small militias in the West Bank, with M16s or AK-47s in Jenin refugee camps firing back at Israeli tanks. This was the extent of the Palestinian resistance, and of course creating homemade bombs that can bomb some Israeli tanks. But besides that, look where we are today in terms of resistance in Gaza. Very armed, very organized army, very tactically developed and advanced. Remember we talked about the lack of wireless communication, the decryption. Now these guys have decryption, they have their own tunnels. And the tunnels themselves, we can talk about them for hours. The fact that these guys literally, no exaggeration, what's the Paris? Dug, sorry, I'm a fob. I continue to use that after 20 years of being here. They dug into the ground with their own nails to create these tunnels. And these tunnels were not all created all for armed resistance, by the way. A lot of them were created to sneak in food from Egypt, because unfortunately Egypt is a collaborator and they're like also besieging Gaza. So these tunnels were created to protect the dignity of Palestinians and for them to sustain themselves and to have that level of sumud, to stand on their feet. So just not just for weapons, because resistance is not just weapons. We talked about this before. But what's important here is that this small piece of land liberated, the whole world now is like literally, I don't want to say plotting, because that sounds like conspiracy theories, like literally obvious in front of us, is fighting that piece of land because these people are refusing to die and they are fighting for the last breath, because they realize, as I started my talk, that as Patrick Wolf mentioned, that land to them is life, and the fight over land is fight over life. So to them, they didn't, as the Palestinian factions in the past rely on Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon to give them support, and even Syria at one point. Now they realize they have to rely on themselves. They started building drones, for God's sake. Imagine a small city that is besieged for over 17, 18 years. They build their own drones. They build their own rockets that can go 160 kilometers. So again, I'm saying all this for educational purposes for the FBI who's sitting around. So all of these things that developed since 2007. So the idea, again, my point from this conversation and discussion, and I'm sorry if I bored you with a lot of minor details here and there, but I figured it would be really boring if we just list all things, like all the history with that context. So I thought I would stop at different pivotal moments in the struggle that I felt that had a major shift in the dynamics, in the progression, the creation, the rise and the fall of certain movements, certain ideologies, and how the Palestinian resistance in itself was not always perfect, as we talked about the example of some, I like to use simple terms like bad things, but like things in Jordan, even in Lebanon at one point, the compromises of some Palestinian leadership who really took upon themselves by being a one-man show to decide the fate of the Palestinian movement, but also the rise of Islamism, the rise of resistance in Gaza, where now we have even Maoist and leftist and Marxist in Gaza, like the PFLP, are also on the rise, and they all themselves have rockets and I don't know if they have drones, but they have a massive advanced weaponry. But this weaponry, again, is no match to the Israeli weaponry, no match to American imperialism and American war machine. I can talk much more, but I think I'll stop here for the sake of having a discussion, and because I think I might have lost some of you. So I'll stop here and open the door for question and answer. And I'm sorry, Lemis, for taking too long.
Thank you so much, Comrade Rasha. That was absolutely no apology necessary. That was very clear. Thank you so much for that. We have about maybe 30 more minutes for Q&A. If there's anyone online, feel free to put your questions into the chat. And then for folks in person, you can raise your hand and we'll bring you the mic. We have one. Do you want to take maybe a round of 2 to 3 questions, or do you want to answer individually? Okay, we'll see how it goes.
Well, I have a few questions. I cannot ask them all, but one question I want to ask, and I don't want to, I'm afraid if I bring this up, I might sound like a conspiracy theorist or something, but I heard that at some point, Netanyahu or somebody actually sent money to Hamas because they wanted to create division among the Palestinians or something. So, is that true? Did that happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's absolutely false. It's ridiculous, not just false, for many reasons. I explained the creation of Hamas in the 80s. I actually wrote an article in response to Mehdi Hassan. I'll be happy to share with some of you who would like to read it, to talk about the history of Muslim resistance from before even 1948 all the way to today. Hamas as a grassroots movement, again, it was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, and their social work go as back as not just 1948, but let's say more intensively in the 70s, specifically in Gaza, and it is known as something called the Mujamma al-Islami. It's like the Islamic center. It was a community center that has schools, daycare, clinics, a place that supports the people that live under occupation. So these people were part of the community. They're not people who came from Mars, like I'm talking about Hamas. They always, as a war on terror campaign, like the Islamists and people who fight American imperialism are always considered to be the bad Muslims and these crazy terrorist extremists that don't represent the aspirations of the people. Hamas are part of Palestine. Hamas is part of families. They're part of the community, just a faction of the community. The leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, was in jail in 1984 for participating in armed resistance in the early 1980s. But then in a prisoners exchange was freed in 1984, and later Hamas was created in 1987. There is zero evidence from anybody ever that Hamas ever took money from Israel. What really took place was Israel at one point were not taking Hamas seriously at the beginning, because Israel was not very attentive to the ideology of the Palestinians within the land of Palestine, historic land of Palestine. Because throughout the struggle, Fatah never presented an ideology. It was always like this open organization that anybody can join. You can be a leftist. This is why I talked about the student brigade that was within Fatah, because they started as a Marxist Maoist movement into later on transforming into becoming an Islamist movement. So Fatah never presented an ideology. Even PFLP was a Marxist Maoist organization, but the ideology, of course, it played a role in recruitment, in understanding the materialist condition of the world and the support, but it was never that important in the sense of, in theorization in the cause of Palestine. So Israel saw the Islamists, the rise of Islamists. They thought that Islamists will continue to do social work, and their rise to power, their rise to popularity would be at the expense of putting pressure on Fatah, because Fatah and Arafat were in Tunisia outside of Palestine, and that maybe will put more pressure on them to get more wins in the Oslo Accords discussion. Of course, Netanyahu was not in power. It was Rabin at that time. But the goal is to play on the division of Palestinians. It's like every single colonizer will always play in the division of the people. And there are true fights that happen between Hamas and Fatah members. In universities, there were clashes. They were fighting each other over ideologies and over things. Like, Palestinians are not angels. They made mistakes. They do a lot of good things. And sometimes, as every single human being, they have their own issues as well. And their own conflict with each other. But there was zero evidence. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, after Sheikh Ahmed Yassin created Hamas in 1987, he was later arrested again. And he was in jail for a very long time. And the only reason he got out of jail was because of the failed Mossad attempt to assassinate Khalid Mash'al in Jordan. And Jordan had to do a condition with Israel where they had to free Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in 1999. And later, Israel assassinated Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in 2003, assassinated the Rantisi in 2003, assassinated almost every single Hamas leader. If really Israel really loves Hamas so much, why did they assassinate their leaders? Why did they expel them to Marj al-Suhur in Lebanon? Why did they kill every single major leader of Hamas and their families? It makes no sense. The money that they're talking about Netanyahu, I'm sorry I give you this background because it's important, but this money situation, it's very simple. But unfortunately, Israel itself, as a democratic colonial state, they themselves have their own friction. You know how Trump always harasses Biden about his son Hunter having a relationship with Russia, right? Or Ukraine or something. Netanyahu and his enemies' political rivalry in Israel, they're having an issue with him because according to the Oslo Accords, Israel collects taxes from Palestinians when you do income tax and purchase tax, and specifically when you are importing and exporting from the land of Palestine, Israel will collect all that tax and it gives it back to the Palestinian Authority. Now, Hamas, after they took over Gaza, they themselves became the ruling power in Gaza. Now, the Palestinian Authority, since they are responsible for the Palestinian people, and since Israel as an occupation power that according to international law are responsible for the occupied people of Palestine, they are responsible to give that money back to Palestinians because that money belongs to Palestinians. This is their tax money. But Israel, as a colonial power, as occupying power, takes that money and gives it back to them. Now, part of the deal was to give 2/3 of that taxes to Ramallah and 1/3 to Gaza. But that money is not given to Hamas directly. That money is given to the PA, the Palestinian Authority, who pays the salaries of the Palestinian Authority employees in Gaza. Because now you have unfortunately, a majority of Palestinians, or a big number of Palestinians, they're considered like government employees. They work for Department of Water, sanitation, mostly like administrative work. And these people are paid by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So the PA doesn't give the money directly to Hamas. They give the money to these ministries to pay the salaries of employees. So that's literally what the money they're talking about. But these extremists in Israel, because they have the political rivalry with Netanyahu, they would like Netanyahu to not even give the money back to the Palestinian Authority, even though it's the tax money for Palestinians. So this is where that nonsense came about. But this is exactly about the money of Netanyahu. But the story about Hamas being a product or byproduct of Israel, with all due respect, is an Orientalist trope where the Palestinians themselves cannot have their own ideologies, they cannot create their own factions, that they will allow someone who doesn't represent them to lead them for decades. It's just insane. That like literally Orientalist trap, that and a racist one as well, because you're making sound like you want to demonize Hamas of they're evil and devils and they came from Mars and they're not like Palestinians. No, Hamas are part of the Palestinian social fabric. Every single family in Palestine has a Fatah member, Hamas member, PLP member. This is who we are. This is Palestine. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you. Should I take, okay. Oh, you're here, okay.
Well, thank you for that presentation. My question was that within the Islamist movements in Palestine, is there like different approaches to the struggle, and if so, like is a lot of it, because a lot of people said the Islamist resistance, a lot of it is backed by Muslim Brotherhood, but is that like, how true is that? And secondly, is there different approaches to that? And just as a follow-up on that, can you speak more in more detail about how the Iranian Revolution had an impact on the rise of Islamism?
Yeah. There isn't a huge difference between Islamic Jihad and Hamas. They both have roots in Muslim Brotherhood, and those who studied Muslim Brotherhood know that Muslim Brotherhood is a social first movement than being an anti-colonialist movement. And part of the reason why they failed, and unfortunately, the coup happened to them in Egypt against Morsi 2013, and why they were naively taken out of power because they don't have an anti-colonialist framework. Their mindset is we can fool America by. Not fool, but we can actually naively think that America will be okay with us because we were democratically elected. So definitely Muslim Brotherhood as an organization did not have that framework. Even though some of their historical leaders like Sayyid Qutb did believe in that, and he wrote about this many times. But as a movement was engaged more in social improvement overall. And this was an actual clash between Hamas leaders in the 70s and the early 80s, where Sheikh Ahmed Yassin had issues with the Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Palestine, because he wanted to establish armed resistance, and some of the other elders did not want to do it yet. They thought they were not ready yet. So there was clash back then. Islamic Jihad was started more of an anti-colonial movement than Hamas. Even though they came from the Muslim Brotherhood mindset and ideology, but they embraced the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979 because of the conversation of we're anti-American hegemony, anti-American imperialism, and Islamic Jihad realized that that is now the pivotal moment where we embrace that mindset and that framework. If you remember when I talked about the ideology shift within Palestine, specifically when the PFLP was created, was in the ages of the Cold War, right? The bipolar issue between Russia and the United States or the Soviet Union. The PFLP realized that our allies, the Soviet Union, they are anti-imperialist, we're going to work with them, and this is our ideology. Same thing happened with Islamic Jihad, that we are Muslims, and this is a nation, and unfortunately, at that time, a lot of our people it's normal that you need help from someone else. Like as a Palestinian action, like resistance, you need money and support. Israel is supported by all of the colonial powers, have billions of dollars, unlimited support. They needed support too. So when they saw a Muslim government in Iran that came about and is using this amazing anti-imperialist rhetoric that is usually reserved for leftists and Marxists, they were happy about it and they embraced it. Hamas came about, and they, in the early days, did not use that language. They used the language of an Islamic concept that it's our responsibility as Muslims to defend our lands, and this is part of our religion. Later on, they started intellectually getting a little bit more in anti-colonialism, and until recently, when Hamas changes charter and they start saying that we are in a nationalist movement, we are for liberation, so they kind of shifted that conversation. But in general, and this is what I was saying earlier today, that ideology wars in Palestine was not too relevant. As what was important is this is our land, we need to fight for it. Whether your ideology is a leftist, Muslim, and as I mentioned in Fatah, we had Marxists, Maoists, Leninists, and we have people who are no atheists or people who are very religious. They're fighting shoulder to shoulder. So ideology did not play a huge role in that sense, even though there were some clashes. In general, that was the case. But yes, Hamas, to answer the other part of your question, is a little bit more pragmatic in the sense of they're okay with playing the international game without compromising, meaning that Hamas says that we are okay with there's a difference here. Fatah has completely sold out in the sense we are okay with two-state solution. We accept the settler colonial project, just give us the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and we're happy. Hamas says no, we will accept for you to give us 1967 borders for now as a state of Palestine, and we create a truce and we'll see what happens in the future. So in essence, they're not admitting or accepting that other part of Palestine belongs to the Zionists now. They're just saying for now, pragmatically speaking, we're not in comparison in terms of power to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. So pragmatically, just give us that part, and in the future, we'll continue that struggle. So they want to continue the liberation struggle, but they want to take gradual efforts into reaching there. I hope that answered the question, but that's the kind of the ideology. Can I take? Okay, you can go ahead. I don't know where the mic is.
First of all, thank you very much for all this. It's been great. I have two questions about ideology. One, I wonder if you could talk about how at the creation of the State of Israel, the Soviet Union supported the creation of the State of Israel and how that affected people's ability to latch on to or glean from a Marxist analysis up until today. And then my second question is, how big of a tent is Hamas? My understanding is that when they got elected, they won 40-something% of the seats, and even the Christian mayor of Bethlehem voted for them. So, how diverse of thought is within that movement?
Quickly, this is the complexity of the Zionist program, is that Zionism was presented as a liberation to Jewish question in Europe. We can't deny that Jews in Europe were prosecuted for hundreds of years. We can't deny that colonial powers, and a lot of scholars talk about this, like Joseph Mas'ad, Abdulhaq al-Masairi, Edward Said, and even Noam Chomsky talk about the concept that Europe kind of killed two birds in one stone. Joseph Mas'ad literally, I think he says, I'm paraphrasing, just I don't want to misquote him. He said, like, Europe has solved the Jewish question by getting rid of the Jews from Europe, but turned them into colonial agents in Palestine. So this is the concept, and we cannot deny that the prosecution happened. We cannot deny that Jews have been prosecuted for hundreds of years. We cannot deny that they were treated. Forget about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was something like completely like significant. But even beyond the Holocaust, Jews have always been looked at as someone that is not pure. They're evil. And we know all the pop culture that exists, unfortunately, in the Western thought about Jews. And this didn't happen only in the modern age. This happened since 1492, when the Spanish Inquisition happened. Right, the concept of Catholicism, the concept of the purity of blood, that the Muslims and the Jews were not pure in their blood. We have to get rid of them and remove them from Europe. So this is a historical prosecution, and there's a historical grievances for Jews in Europe. So this is something we have to admit. Unfortunately, Zionists themselves use that pain as a recruiting tool to force people to migrate to Palestine. They were promised that this land of Palestine is empty. It's an opportunity for us, as they always say, a people without a land for a land without a people. But unfortunately, the settler Jews who came from Europe, some of them embraced the concept of, you know what, in order for us to survive here, we have to become colonizers ourselves. And that's literally what happened. And I can talk about the Zionist relationship with colonial powers for ages, and I can simply quote you Herzl, who invited your British public figures and calling them, I'm inviting you to something colonial, and I'm quoting. He said he called the project of Israel something colonial, and he said, like, I'm inviting you to invest in a project that will become a rampart between Europe and barbarism, like an outpost of civilization against barbarism in East Asia. So this concept was created from the beginning. However, there are part of that liberation, specifically some of these Marxist, there was some concept of Marxist Zionists that existed at that time, thinking that maybe our job is to go there, create these settlements, and there's a term for it, it's escaping me right now, creating these farms, kibbutz, yes. Kibbutz, and Bernie Sanders, I think, was there, or he supported one of that. So the concept is that let's create kibbutz, the answer to Bertalia, we become the peasants. We model that Marxist analysis, and we ourselves create something different. But unfortunately, that eventually failed. And even the Marxist and the socialist party in Israel eventually failed miserably. There was a Marxist movement that existed in Israel. There was Palestinians involved in it along with Israelis, and eventually it was a joke. Because you can't be Marxist. You claim to be Marxist. You can't be claiming to be an anti-imperialist, but you're supporting a settler colonial project that is supported by colonizers and imperialism at large. So yes, that existed at the beginning, and I hope I give you a little bit of context in terms of the liberation of the Jews from Europe into thinking that we can do something else. But unfortunately, Zionism was too psychotic and too involved in imperialism and colonialism that they couldn't go that around. And it comes to the answer of Hamas. Hamas is significantly popular and strong in Palestine. And that was evident in the election. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Christians in Palestine, and this is something very important in Palestine, there's almost zero division between Muslims and Christians in Palestine. Like in Palestine, and I'm not trying to create an angelic like perfect image of Palestinians. I already talked about the nonsense that some Palestinians did in Jordan, but that division doesn't exist, thankfully, because of the unity over the land. For them realizing that we are the natives, we are the indigenous people of Palestine, and this war is against all of us completely. And the Zionist project is, as I mentioned earlier, is not attentive to the religion and ideology of their colonial subjects. They're only attentive and only paying attention to eliminate the indigenous population. Because whether they're Muslims or Christian, they are a threat. Their mere existence is a threat to their colonial project, because against settler colonialism, we have to erase the culture and the identity of the people. So the identity, the religion, the background, the history, the culture is all dangerous, and they have to get rid of it. That's the indigenous life. So yes, there's many times where Christian Palestinians supported Hamas and voted for them and spoke in favor of them. Even the Christian priest Muslim, his name, ironically, his last name is Muslim. He's a Christian priest. He constantly defends Hamas and says, like, we're living here in I don't want to even say the word peace, because it sounds Orientalist. Like, we don't need like these concepts. This is our people. We are one people. We're not different for us to say we live in peace. We are family together. But the other part is, yes, Hamas and Palestinians in general. Hamas is part of the social dynamic, part of the social fabric. They're like someone's brother, someone's uncle, someone's father, sister, mother, and grandmother. This is part of our society. But as I mentioned earlier, and I made sure to mention that Palestinians changed their I don't want to say loyalty, but they change who they vote for, who they give this trust to, based on their resistance program. And this is what I said, and I said it was very important to mention that Fatah lost its credibility since the end of 70s and 80s, all the way to the Oslo Accords, when they gave them and started compromising. So Palestinians understand the importance of resistance, and understand, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, that resistance is the only way to liberate Palestine. So anybody who compromises that, and anybody who starts speaking ill of the resistance and giving up resistance, they will lose credibility, and somebody else will gain momentum. And this is why I mentioned how Fatah came to power, then PFLP, then Hamas, Islamic Jihad is now getting power. So it depends on, if you have a resistance program, people will be in favor of you. If you compromise, and I assure you, if Hamas in the future start compromising like Fatah, they will also lose credibility and they will lose momentum, and people will move on to another movement that really reflect their aspirations of a liberation movement. Anything else? Yes. Do we have?
I was wondering if you could speak a little more to the rise of the resistance since Hamas was elected, and how, since Hamas was elected in 2006, like over the past 20 years, like being under siege and so much of the population is displaced and experiencing so much violence. So how did that come about, like in spite of all this?
Yeah, very good question. There's two parts to this question. The resistance, I'm assuming you're talking about mostly armed resistance, right? In the West Bank versus Gaza. In the West Bank is a little bit easier to analyze because, as we know, after Hamas took over 2006, the U.S. realized that we cannot allow, and as many of you now will start smirking or smiling, they cannot allow democracy in Palestine because democracy will render results that they're not in favor of. This reminds us of what? Chile, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, like almost everywhere in the world. When America doesn't like the democratic process, they end up sabotaging it by assassinating Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran, or coups, or like in Egypt, or whatever it is. So they sent someone called Major General Dayton, who went to the West Bank and worked with the Palestinian Authority. As I mentioned, Palestinian Authority is completely sold out, and they became tools of colonization and tools for the occupiers. They themselves came up, and General Dayton publicly, and there's a lot, you can research him and you can see what he talks about. He came up with the concept of the new Palestinian breed. He literally used these words, new Palestinian breed. The concept that the Palestinian security forces that he worked on will have no problem with Israel, but will have a problem with the terrorist Hamas members. Meaning that the focus now, the campus of the Palestinian security forces is to attack Hamas members and not Israeli soldiers. And in the Palestinian pop culture, we always laugh. There was one time an incident where, just to make fun a little bit, because I was very dry in my conversation. A couple of years ago, there was a security forces officer, or was like a captain, like high level, where he was actually fixing an Israeli army vehicle. They had a flat tire, and this guy got on his knees and he helped them fixing the flat tire. This is your occupying body, like occupying power, occupying forces that have been occupying us for 100 years. You have an officer of the security forces of Palestinians getting on their knees, helping them fix the flat tire. This is the new Palestinian breed. They sold out, so in essence, they are stopping and they're working tirelessly to stop any resistance in the West Bank. Anytime there's any group that is thinking about resistance, they will find about them, throw them in jail, or as what we know in Palestine, the Tansiq al-Amni, or the security collaboration between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. They would call their Israeli handlers and tell them there's potentially a Hamas cell being created in this village, go take care of it. Second day, Israel will go and assassinate these people or throw them in jail. So in West Bank, organized resistance was not possible since 2007 until today. However, what we see now is, as the Westerners called, or Western, epistemology, the lone wolf attacks. We have individual Palestinians. It sent us back to pre-1948. Remember when I talked about there was no organized resistance? It was like a couple of peasants from the villages. They will get together and start attacking Israeli Haganah military soldiers, or colonial British colonizer soldiers. Some of these guys will literally have a knife and they will jump an Israeli soldier and try to attack them. This is what's happening in the West Bank. Recently, though, there has been more organized. And if you've seen the news, Nur Shams refugee camp in Tulkarem today, there's a group of Palestinian armed resistance fighters that are actually trying to bring back resistance in the West Bank, in Jenin and other refugee camps. However, in the West Bank, Hamas since 2007 has been building its power significantly. And as I gave you the example of the laughable fireworks rockets in 2001 all the way today where Hamas has developed drones and rockets that can go to 160 kilometers away. So clearly Hamas has been working day and night. Of course, it's not by themselves. They get support from Syria. They got support from Iran. They were sneaking in weapons from Libya after the Arab Revolution and from Egypt, many places. There's many reasons, but they invested into building infrastructure. They invested in building their capacities and training their soldiers, sending them to Iran to train. So they invested into building an organized army. And the shift here was that now the resistance in Gaza has becoming more systematic in the sense of acting as an army, where they realize after all these wars that the backlash from Israel will be too strong against civilians. Again, it sends us back to what I used to tell you before. Anytime there is a resistance movement, Israel takes it back on what? On the civilians. This is their deterrence theory to stop people from resisting. So Hamas now realized that, number one, they're in power of Gaza. They're responsible to bring food and clean water to the people, but they are the resistant fighters themselves. So it created a big problem for them. And a lot of people at the beginning of 2006, 2007 start saying, oh, Hamas now is going to follow the footsteps of Fatah. They're going to compromise. They're going to stop resisting, and they're going to start caring about politics only. Clearly, Hamas proved them wrong, because they got, not only that they're continuing, they got much stronger than before in resistance. And what they did last year in October 7 was obviously clear that these guys mean business about resistance. They were not just sitting down and following the footsteps of Fatah. So now their steps in terms of their resistance is more controlled, more restrained, it's more strategic, it's more tactical. You can see even in their PR messages that very psychological warfare. Like, you can see that these guys are not playing. Like, they're not like unorganized militias like it happened in the 40s and 50s and the 60s. Even when Fatah and PFLP were very strong, they were still like unorganized militias. And this is part of why these organizations failed. And as I mentioned, in Jordan and Lebanon, because the leaders were hanging out in bars and hanging out in Lebanon and Beirut, and little soldiers were going and just acting about our resistance. Hamas created a different model. Their leaders and their soldiers are in the tunnels building and getting ready. So now their resistance is becoming a little bit more costlier, because now they're in charge of the Gaza Strip, as we're seeing today. And this is what Israel is doing, is making it clear, anytime you make any attacks from Gaza, then the whole population will pay. Again, population-centric counterinsurgency is part of the colonial archive. So I hope that answers it. But yes, the resistance has moved from an attack here and there to Hamas having actually almost, with Islamic Jihad having and PFLP have complete power and control. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, I don't want to drag this any further, but a couple of years ago, there were some people are accusing Hamas of dominating the decision in terms of when do you engage in armed resistance. But according to Hamas, is that like, look, and we're in charge of the whole strip, we're in charge of 2 million people, we have to calculate strategically, which is, I think, following the footsteps of Hezbollah. I think that's the concept that they're following. They needed to mature politically and strategically, which is what Hezbollah does in southern Lebanon. They don't allow anybody to throw one rock without their permission, because they have their own calculations. You have pros and cons to that, but that's the reality, at least today.
Thank you so much, Raja. If we can give Raja one more round of applause. Do you have any other closing comments or anything you'd like to make?
Thanks for asking me. One thing I want to leave you with is that I think after what we are witnessing nowadays in Palestine, the sacrifices that we are witnessing in Gaza. I was talking to even Professor Hafsa before, the concept that people are, when they're losing their loved ones, they're thanking God, like in their faith, that thank you for blessing me for, or allowing me to sacrifice for my family for the sake of the cause. This level of faith, this level of dedication, this level of resilience that we are witnessing. And I'm not talking only about the 35,000 murders that were just killed in Gaza. I'm talking about life is being destroyed in Gaza. Like, in order for Gaza to be rebuilt again, it was going to take maybe 10 years. So for resistance and for the people of Gaza, unfortunately, they will be like on the shelf for at least 10 years. All of the sacrifices of people here, The people protesting in Colombia risking their education. People are lost their jobs. This is an unprecedented moment in the Palestinian struggle. And I was saying this before, is that in the protest in the past, if we have like a couple thousand people, that will be a really good day. To have thousands of people on a daily basis since for the past 6 months is not something that we've witnessed before. Clearly, the relationship between, the occupation of Palestine, the struggle in Gaza, and the struggle against Western hegemony and imperialism and racism, and the fight against capitalism, clearly all of them are connected. And I've talked about this many times before, that the war in Gaza is literally an extension or a microcosm of our war against materialism and against capitalism and against Western hegemony and colonialism. With all of these sacrifices, it's time for us to really lift up our narrative and our epistemology. I don't think we should be allowing people to demonize resistance anymore. In the past, this rhetoric about, West Bank doesn't have Hamas, why is Israel committing crimes there? You know what, Hamas doesn't represent all of Palestinians, let's forget about Hamas, let's talk about something else. Comparing Hamas with Netanyahu, all of these ridiculous racist Orientalist tropes, we can't accept them anymore. People who claim to be pro-Palestine, but they don't want to lose their career, they're worried about liberal sensitivities and sensibilities. I don't think we should allow that in our movements anymore. Our movement is about national liberation. And without resistance, we can't be liberated. As I mentioned before, this is a struggle on the land, and the land is our life. And if colonialism and settler colonialism, which is the project of Israel, is about violence, it was created by violence. It's constantly perpetrating violence against our people in Palestine, all of Palestine. It's even perpetrating violence against Palestinians overseas. It's committing violence for people even in the U.S. here. And I don't want to be using American exceptionalism, but the money here goes to support this settler colonial project in Palestine. So all these sacrifices and all this pivotal moment that really happened, we should really clean up our movement. And I don't mean this in a nihilistic way, don't get me wrong, but we should not be okay with allowing Orientalist and racist language in our movement against resistance in general. And I'm not trying to defend Hamas or anybody else, every single Palestinian movement, nobody's above criticism. But to demonize resistance and compare it with terrorism and compare it with Israel and Netanyahu, they're not the same thing. You can argue against Hamas all you want and say they made mistakes about anything you want. I don't care. But to demonize resistance and compare resistance to Israeli criminals and terrorists, that's undermining Palestine. Because when you undermine resistance, you're undermining the cause. Then all you care about is Israel, please minimize the level of friction with Palestinians and we'll live in peace. But there's no peace. There's no concept of peace in a settler colonial project. The only way forward is for the settler colonial project to cease to exist. There's no other way. Either that or the Palestinians and the indigenous people of Palestine are eliminated. And hopefully that's never going to happen. So at this moment, I really think as a movement, we need to rise and we need to clean up our epistemology. We need to clean up our terminology. We need to make sure that anybody who would like to join the movement, you're welcome. But there are guiding principles that we have. Palestine is a national liberation project, and the resistance is the most important aspect of that project. Demonizing it by using the word Hamas, especially, it's not going to get you a free card. Because when you do that, you know what you're doing. Because as we talked about here today, and I mentioned this when I was asked about the influence of Hamas, Hamas is only the most famous faction in the Palestinian resistance. They're not the only resistance, but they embody the resistance solution for Palestinians. When you demonize them, then you're demonizing resistance. When you demonize resistance, then you are demonizing Palestinians at large. So this is not something that should be allowed. And I think these sacrifices, and I assure you, and I talk to people overseas, and I read the things that they say, and I understand the mindset that they have, and I understand why they resist, and I understand why Gaza is standing tall against this colonial war against them, because they want to protect the cause. They're willing to sacrifice their lives for the cause, but we're not willing to hurt the feelings of liberal sensibilities, I think that's ridiculous. And I think at this point, we can't go back. This concept of trying, and I end with this, and forgive me for taking long. For a long time, for the longest time, the elders used to tell me, and the people, especially in the Palestinian community and the Muslim community, we need to show a good face of the Palestinians. We need to win the popular support. We've been doing that for 100 years. What did that get us? 6 months in of genocide, what did the popular support get us? What did the international community get us? What did being a perfect victim get us? Of course, without getting into the problematic idea of being a perfect victim, that's just a tool for the colonizers for us to submit, to force us to submit. But what did that get us? Clearly, the only way for us to survive is what? Is resistance. So any way to undermine the resistance by any means, we're sometimes using these tactics to play the role of using the bad Muslim terrorist crap, that should not be allowed, it should not be rejected. Resistance is part of the Palestinian struggle. If you want to be part of the Palestinian struggle, that's something that is very important to us. If you don't want to be, I'm not telling you 24 hours to defend it. I'm not saying that. At least don't undermine it. Don't talk about it if you're worried about your job, whatever. I don't care. I don't judge. I understand everybody plays a different role, but the moment you undermine it, then you repeat the enemy's PR and the enemy's propaganda crap, and that's not something we should be tolerating. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Rasha, for that extremely clear and necessary political intervention. Please do not apologize. I would be down to stay here for 3 more hours. Anybody else? Okay, no, never mind, but I will be here. Thank you so much, really. I think you outlined kind of the criticalness of this moment, and this, 6 months going on, resistance is continuing to get stronger and stronger. Right now, up at Columbia, many of our comrades are there for the 5th day of this monumental encampment. A bunch of us are going there right after, so I implore all of you to come with us. Also, we have to continue building up this movement. On Mondays here, if you have not been, on Mondays we have volunteer meetings at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm part of the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, the People's Forum, the Palestinian Youth Movement, a bunch of organizations are a part of. Please come get plugged in. We have to keep this energy going. 6 months in is unacceptable, but we have to keep building the mass movement here in the US. We have a duty, we have a historic responsibility. So feel free to ask any of us here about how you can get more involved, and we'll see you there.